First, do not try to cover everything. Choose 5 learning objectives that you think are important and scan all of the lecture materials that you've used over the last few years and see what aspects cover those 5 learning objectives. And second, see if you can take what you tell students and turn them into questions that the students can answer themselves and learn from themselves. Well, for me it was a very interesting challenge because I had to change the way I taught. I had to reflect a little bit more on what my objectives were and really match my pedagogy to the objectives. So it's been a very, very useful event for me. It's been useful for me to really rethink how I think about teaching. One of the things I do here that I didn't do in my previous life as a teacher on a semester system was that I have to very much think about my learning objectives and my learning outcomes and what I want the students to actually learn, not more generally like critical thinking or written expression, but specifically about each course. So a course I'm teaching now in media and politics, I want them to be able to think critically about the media and be able to use certain social science theories to provide the language to understand media events and certain technologies. And because of this, I've been able to take what I had as traditional lectures and transform them into very focused problem areas that students work on and solve. And I've enjoyed that tremendously. So for me, it's reinvigorated my teaching, and I've had a wonderful time working with students. It's much better than lecturing to them.
And I think what I've been able to do is, especially in blocks where students come in without much knowledge of the topic, build some skills early on. So you set a tone early on of these are the fundamentals of this topic, whether you're looking through a microscope or reading a novel. There are certain skills that the professionals in the field like us use to do that. And if you can get students to learn those skills early on in the block, some of them of course take many years to learn, but you give them some of the essentials and then let them apply those skills. And towards the end of the block, they're applying those skills and coming up with their own analysis of whatever it is. So by the end of the block, they've completed something that is original work to them. It may be done a lot in the field, but to them it seems new, it seems original, and they're creating part of it. And what I find is they take ownership of at least part of that educational experience. And it's not all sort of presented to them. A lot of it's presented to them, assimilated, and then they come back. They're given time and focus to come back and create something, whether it be a presentation, write a paper, or do a project. And that, to me, starting heavy with sort of the skills or the terminology or the definitions and then applying those later in the block is what makes a successful block. But by the end, they feel the ownership, they feel like they can attack whatever you're trying to teach them by themselves or by themselves with help from the professor. Yeah, as far as what I find the students will do is the first few days they feel out the block because it's a new class every 3 weeks, every month. And so if they feel like, oh, this one's easy, they set their own tone quite early. And so I think it's quite important to articulate to the students what's going to happen in the class and make sure that the rigor is there early on. Because it's always better in a block, the intense block environment, in my mind, it will naturally go up at the end, the amount of work, because you'll have projects due and you'll be getting into the material. But starting really, really slow and then really building at the end is difficult on the students because they'll put stuff off and then it'll be overwhelming at the end. So starting, what I like to do is keep it pretty even throughout the block. So starting with the type of material changes, content-based usually early on and then application later on. But having it be enough work and enough intensity that they understand that they're going to maintain that, and then I'm not going to crank it up at the end to overwhelm them. Yeah. And the other part is a little bit of a step back, and I try to think about the rhythm of a block. So I use a calendar. I just have a blank calendar. I don't know if that shows up. Does that show up?
I will do that after that.
Yeah, okay. I just start with a blank calendar, and I think about where I'm going to have major assignments due, and what's the mindset of the student going to be after they've read a novel in 1 or 2 nights, assimilated it, written a paper, had discussions, and then turned in this final paper. What's it going to be like for them? Are they going to be exhausted the next day? Do I think it's going to get them pumped up? And what I try to do is schedule it so some days in class are really detail-oriented and intense, and other days might be a more of a fun activity that gets the content across. And I try to think, without manipulating too much, the psyche of the students and the rhythm of the block. Weekends are very important. One, to have time for the students to do an extended project, if you want. Also time to recover, and everybody needs to recover. Sometimes you can alternate between them doing a big project on the weekend and you having time to get away and do whatever you need to do. And then maybe another weekend you might take a day or half a day to grade their essays. And so you can get it back to them Monday, and they might get a day off and be able to recover and do all the other stuff that they need to do to come into class ready to go. I would say the first thing not to do when going from a semester system, as most of us will have to do, to the block plan, is to try to teach your course the way you had it. So you have all this material, you have a lot of time in between for the students to read material or synthesize material, that you can't do it. There simply isn't enough time to do all of that. And so I would say you prioritize what you want to do. And what we can do on the block plan is we can skim across the top and cover some diverse material, but also go down deep into a novel or into a scientific concept, where the students are spending 2 or 3 days only thinking about that one concept. And if they can do that with the right mindset, they can go, and then you could even have a list of books. Here are the books that I normally taught in this course. I recommend that you read them to further your study. And what that allows you to do is sort of have this lifetime learning idea, rather than taking a course in something and okay, I took that course, I know what it is. You have, okay, I can go and investigate that. I learned a lot about it in the block, and now I'm armed with the skills to go and learn more. So I would say one of the things not to do is try to just take your course and shrink it down time-wise and schedule everything hour by hour, minute by minute to get it all in. It's challenging and it's tough, and what you find is what I do is I teach the same class 2 blocks in a row, and for me especially is I will use a lot of my material and just not all of it in one block. If I have different students the next block, they'll see different things that I've taught before. Other things would be to pay attention to scheduling, and don't allow the class to get away from you and be overwhelming at the end. And don't be afraid to have times where there's a little bit of a break. It seems like because it's compressed, you have to have every moment as intense as possible. But sometimes having an hour-long discussion in class, or class ends an hour early one day, is a great thing to do. You'll see benefits, rewards the next day or the next week that you wouldn't get from just slogging through that material. Because you think you need to. And then the last thing I would say is allow time for the students to work through things. As an instructor, you commonly want to make the students understand and have them understand and get it. And what I've found is going too fast with that doesn't work as well. And it can be a little bit frustrating. You feel like you're not covering everything you need to, but the process of them figuring it out is vital in my mind, to this educational model. And so instead of giving a lecture on something and assuming the students understand it and then moving on, allowing discussion or a writing activity or a reflection to see what the students are getting out of it is very important, and it takes time. So in starting the scheduling of block, what I do is I'll start with a blank page, and let's just pretend that these, for our block, these are different months, but we have 18 days. So we have 3 days and then 3 full weeks. And what I'll do is I start with a blank slate so I can think about how I want to structure this, where I want the main projects to happen. For me, I do field trips as well. How do I want to slot the field trips in to shake up the attitude of the students, to think about the workload, when are the projects, when are the big readings, when is everything done. And then in scheduling that, well, I just start by, a lot of our faculty do this and they just use sticky notes, and they'll put a sticky note on here saying final paper due, or in this case poster presentation. And then how does everything fit around that? If there's a big reading, for example, how many days do the students need to do that? And having those sticky notes really allows you to be creative and move those things around. And so I'll just use this class as an example. This was a foundation course, an introductory course on geology. And what I do here is early on, this is mostly in black here, is mostly content. And you can see right here on day 2 already, I have a homework that's due. On day 3, I have a homework that's due. And then those combine into a larger assignment that is part of their grade, their final grade. So what I'm able to do is give them comments on this style of work, comments on this style of work, and then they take those comments, put it together overnight, and finally hand in this what I call a lab as a project. And then I get that back to them on the final day of the first week. And so going into that weekend, they sort of know where the course is, they know what to expect. And now that's a short turnaround time for me. But what I do is I design this lab to be relatively easy to grade, relatively quick to grade, and I've already looked at a lot of their work. And so that final product isn't necessarily the culmination of all of this that I have to grade. It might be a few different questions that I grade, and they get credit for getting those questions correctly by doing this material well. And so you can be creative about how you design what you need to assess based on how you do these sorts of things. And it all comes down to how you schedule the block. And so here I have the first week sort of content heavy, and then in the second week we start with a field trip, and then they do a project for a few days. And they start writing a paper. They hand me a draft here on day 3, and then I get those drafts back to them by Friday, and then that final draft is due over the weekend. So in this case, they're working all week on the lab activities for this. It's called a columnar joint, is the topic of the paper, and they do a draft of that paper. I get it back to them, and then they have the weekend, the 2 full days on the weekend, to simulate what I've asked and what I've given them and return that paper. They turn it in on the Monday. So in that case, they're using that weekend as project work time. In this particular class, you can see here in the last week, we have 2 big projects. So one, we look at where to find oil and gas, and we do a mapping activity, and then we have a discussion of that mapping activity through this activity in class, so a 3-hour-long activity in class that's a land auction. And then what that does is it breaks up the class. It's a fun activity, but very informative for the students, where they're applying what they learned here to give them an advantage in this land auction, where they buy different pieces of land that should be more rich in oil and natural gas. And it's sort of a competition. So the learning is sort of a fun learning activity. And then we have a final project, which is the last, in this case, 4 days of the class, where we go and map something in the field, and they turn in their map on the last day. And so what this last project does is it takes all 3 of these weeks, all the context, it puts in context everything they've learned, with them making an original map of a place, of an outcrop that we go to, and they have to apply all of these concepts to get a good synthesis of that material.
Par exemple, j'ai enseigné un cours de statistique en avril dernier et dans un système de blocs, il n'est pas efficace pour une personne de juste bavarder comme une pie pendant 3 heures et donc j'ai décidé pour que mes étudiants ont fait le groupe de 4 personnes et un jour pendant une période de 4 jours dans mon cours, chaque groupe était responsable de guider pour enseigner à son coéquipier pendant 2 heures de 3. Et on a, dans cette course de statistiques, on a créé le 4 test statistique principal. Chaque groupe était responsable pour apprendre, pour enseigner, créer une handout de 4 pages pour les étudiants de comprendre tous les détails, faire un exemple et aussi créer une petite lab, une activité pendant chaque personne dans le groupe assiste tous les autres d'utiliser notre système de software pour maîtriser ce système de test statistique, ici le One-Way ANOVA, Analysis of Variance, et avec cette méthode, les étudiants ont renforcé leur connaissance de ce matériel parce que bien sûr, on connaît que quand on a besoin d'enseigner le matériel aux autres, on va apprendre ça plus efficacement. Et c'était juste un exemple que j'ai fait d'apprentissage que j'ai fait dans le système de blocs pour donner le pouvoir aux étudiants pour d'enseigner à eux, pas juste moi, parce que quand j'étais un étudiant, c'était juste un professeur, 100 étudiants et c'était ça pendant 4 ans. Et mon but, spécialement dans un système de blocs, est de donner le pouvoir à eux. Et c'était ma responsabilité d'être leur guide. Et c'est ça que je voulais faire, je veux faire.
When I came to Quest, I had been teaching on a quarter system and I had been teaching on a semester system. And I initially came in thinking that I could take my classes that I'd prepped on a quarter system or a semester system and just do them faster and take exactly the same lectures, exactly the same readings, exactly the same everything, and kind of just slide it into a block, and it would be a really easy transition for me. And what I found when I did that, I actually did it with 2 courses before I learned. It took me 2 blocks before I figured this one out. I was giving them full textbooks to read. I was giving them essays, very traditional essays. I was transplanting a very traditional method onto a block system, and it was a nightmare. I was warned when I first got to Quest that and not to give them too much work, because my instinct would be to overburden them with readings and with assignments. And I smiled and nodded and said thanks for the advice, and then I proceeded to give them as much work as I thought they should have. And my very first block, on the 4th day of the block, I realized that I was teaching for 3 hours a day, and then I was grading for 9 hours a day. And I couldn't keep that up. So I walked into the class and said, so I made this rookie mistake and I've given you way too much work, and it's given me way too much work. So now I've got to figure out how to switch this. So my first piece of advice is to be incredibly flexible and very generous with yourself when you're first starting. And by generous with yourself, I mean kind to yourself. You'll make mistakes that you'll realize later were mistakes you shouldn't have made, but if you had have actually known, you wouldn't have made those mistakes. I have learned over the last 5 years that I need to have them do more work and me do less work, because I didn't get that balance. It took me years to get that balance, and probably it was my 3rd year of teaching on a block system before I finally got the balance. And the balance is they have to think. I give them stuff that they have to think about, and then they give me maybe a 1,000-word paper instead of a 10,000-word paper, maybe a 250-word paper instead of a 1,000-word paper, so that I can come at that in a manageable piece with only 20 students in the class. My other piece of advice is to prep everything ahead of time. It's July right now, and I am prepping courses that I'm teaching in October, November, January, and February. And if I don't go in with a syllabus and at least a really good outline of what I'm doing every day, then I'm lost, because you can't prep and teach on a block. Flexibility is something that we talk about with everybody we phone interview, with everybody who comes up for an interview. We speak to students about it, and we remind each other about it. And trying new things is scary, and it's hard, and there's times where you question why you're bothering, but ultimately it's the most rewarding thing I've ever done. And we couldn't have done it if we didn't come in with that flexibility. So if we weren't willing to give, if we weren't willing to sort of bend with the wind, one of the jokes that we have right now is that every policy we make at Quest has the word normally in it. And that's just for that kind of flexibility. And you also need that with your students. That's the other thing that we've really learned, is that we need to be able to wiggle with the students so that they get what they need, because there's absolutely no point at all in revolutionizing undergraduate education if it's not about the students.
It's challenging. I will not try to hide that. It's challenging because I've been teaching the same subject. Subject has evolved a little bit, fortunately, but basically about the universe for 35 years. I have a lot of very carefully structured lecture notes. They're all up my head now. I don't have to use my notes. I have nice presentations. I have a set of graphics. I can present information, pour information out to people. But we know from educational research that's not the way people learn. It's a very ineffective way of learning. Confucius knew this, right? Confucius 2,500 years ago said, "Tell me and I will forget, show me and I will remember, involve me and I will understand." So the biggest transition can be summed up by that phrase. Tell me, I can do that. I can tell you. I could talk to you about the universe for 15 hours straight right now, and you'll forget it. So you have to go from telling to involving. So I'll give you an example. I teach a course at Columbia on the solar system, on planets around stars. And one of the first things one has to do is say, how do planets move around stars? How does the Earth go around the sun? And the answer is that Kepler, 400 years ago, came up with 3 laws of planetary motion, which turned out to be correct and actually predated Newton's understanding of gravity. So they were just empirical laws, like how do the planets move? And so in my lecture, I will stand at the board. I don't use PowerPoint, I will confess. Stand at the board and I'll write down Kepler's 3 laws, and I'll draw diagrams, and I'll draw arrows from P to this and from A to that so people can see them. And then I'll work through one problem about, given the distance of a planet from a star, how long does it take to go around, and solve the equation on the board. And that's 20 minutes, and I can move on to the next subject. Here, when I teach Kepler's 3 laws, I come into class, everybody has their laptops. I have a sheet that's got about 30 questions or so on it. I have them log into this very sophisticated simulation website and start playing with it, seeing this is about planets going around other stars, but it works just as well. And you can adjust all the parameters. The data comes in as though it were coming through a telescope, and there's noise on it, and you can change the size of the telescope to make the noise lower, and the brightness of the star, and the distance, and all these other parameters. And they start going through these questions. And it takes 3 hours. It takes the entire class. But by the end of 3 hours, they have derived Kepler's 3 laws the way Kepler did from data, right? Not with a computer, obviously, but it took him 10 years. They can do it in 3 hours. That's pretty good. But they have derived Kepler's 3 laws. Now, neither of these sets of students, my students from my lecture and my students from Quest, 5 years from now are going to remember Kepler's 3 laws, most likely, unless one of them turns into an astronomer. But the ones from Columbia will just forget the facts of Kepler's 3 laws. The ones from Quest will forget the facts of Kepler's 3 laws, but they'll remember how one goes to nature and derives a model of the way nature works from data, from actually doing observations. And that's a much more valuable skill to take away from a class than remembering that the period squared is equal to the semi-major axis cubed of a planet going around a star.
So, in a typical 3-hour block class, I will assign, I will schedule different activities. Usually the first 15 to 20 minutes of my class are spent recapping the previous day. What did we talk about yesterday? What were the important ideas? Are there any questions that anyone has? Sometimes that can extend because people do really have valuable questions, but this is the point. There's plenty of time, so I'm not worried. So we take that time. Then usually for the next 30 to 45 minutes, I'll present the students with some new idea for the day. Could be a question, could be an extension of something we've talked about the previous day, but we'll talk, and I'll be talking with them. So I may lecture for just a little bit of that time, but mostly it's give and take. I'm asking questions, I'm asking for their input. Then I give them an assignment. Usually what I'll have them do is some sort of work that they will do with other people. And like an activity where I'll have them work on a problem. Sometimes I'll have them work by themselves, or sometimes in pairs. Sometimes they can choose, sometimes in groups of 3, 4, or 5. And I give them the problem, and I say what they're responsible for. Your job is to solve this problem and come back and present to the class, or to write a paragraph about whatever I want from them, and then either they work on that in class or I send them away. And then we regather, we review what people have discussed. Sometimes people present ideas, etc. We spend maybe another 30 or 45 minutes wrapping up the idea and kind of thinking about what comes next. And then at the end of class, we reflect on what is the most important element of that class. That's kind of a typical class I would teach. Not every class looks like that. Sometimes maybe we have a lot of material that I want to get through, and so we spend more time doing the interactive lecture. Or maybe they really do a lot more of their own work, and maybe I have a couple different activities distributed. But what I find is that because it's a 3-hour period, different activities that involve different ways of giving attention, like looking and taking notes versus talking to other people, they welcome that, as do I, so that they don't just sit there and get tired. I have started to see that the block provides a really nice way of turning your class into a powerful story, like with an arc to it. So there's, in terms of having the students recreate the experience of discovery, of inquiry of a subject, works really well with the block. So for example, in a calculus course, I really want students to relive the experience of discovering calculus. So the way I've set up that course is to look and see what are the major questions that people asked that led to the development and the refinement of calculus. And I think calculus, I get them down to about 4 questions in the class. How do we study things that move? How do we measure the maximum and minimum of quantities? How do we measure areas, etc.? Anyway, these questions, and then we start the course by getting right into that first question. And so rather than the course being like a set of topics that I've told them it's important to know, it's like the course is an invitation to deepen the story at every pass. And I think that's a real advantage to the block system. So my first bit of advice is when setting up a block course, to think about what is it really that you want the students to leave the course with, what questions will be valuable to explore, and how can that fit together in an organic story that can unfold over the 3.5 week period that you're doing the course. I think that because they'll be immersed in the subject constantly and be dealing with it that way, it is an opportunity to really live and breathe the subject, and to have it be accessible to students, have them really get a good experience out of it. I think it's valuable to think about how that lives as a kind of story. So when I design a block course, the first thing I do is think about what are the fundamental questions that I want to investigate in this course, and what are the, say, 3 or 4 important ideas that I really want them to wrestle with and to think about and come out talking about. And then in designing the block schedule, as I said a bit earlier, rather than taking a textbook and looking at the list of topics I want to get down, instead I want to look at sort of the main ideas and fit them in. So when I'm doing a block system, I have a calendar in front of me of the whole block, and I start thinking about, I have a calendar in front of me of the whole block, and I start thinking about, okay, how much time do I want to spend on this topic, and how much time do I want to spend on this topic, and how much time on this question, and I start building it this way, and then I spend some time thinking about that. And once I have sort of the basic idea for how I want things to fit, so for example in calculus, we're going to spend about a week talking about how things move, and I've got an idea for them to do an experiment where they will roll balls down a ramp and start measuring them, and then we can start trying to do some math about understanding that. That'll lead to my next problem on the last day of that week. And the following week I want to spend most of it practicing different calculation techniques, and I've got some ideas for how to do that with some different experiments. And then for my third week I want them to be practicing ideas of how they measure things that are big and small and how they measure areas. Anyway, you can see that what I'm trying to do is just basically lay out the time periods for each of the major topics, and then I will come back and try and put in specific activities that fit that. So notice the difference there is if I had a textbook, the textbooks are normally made for semester courses, and you just sort of pick a topic and match it to a day. I'm doing the backwards of that. Rather than putting the topics in, the topics going last, I'm trying to build the course of the architecture of the big things first. And I think that's a helpful way of approaching it. Of course, it's important to keep assignments balanced throughout the block so that they don't crunch at the end. I'm sure Steve talked about this, but the rhythm of the block is something that's very different than the rhythm of the semester. And so scheduling assignments with enough space in between them so that you can mark effectively and that things don't bunch up, I think is a pretty crucial factor that you can do in the planning of that. Planning in advance is particularly important on the block. You don't need to have every single day and every single activity mapped down to what it's going to be. I find you don't need that, but you need to have the overall structure, what the days are more or less going to be about, and that has to be more or less set before the block starts. Once a block starts, it's pretty difficult to try and plan it in a global sense. It's already going, and I find I can do day-to-day things and adjust day-to-day, but as much of it as I have prepared in advance makes a difference. So as much as you can have a basic framework of the block that you want to have, and an idea of what the assignments and activities will be, the better you are. In fact, now I won't start a block unless I know all the assignment dates, all the assignment due dates, and the basic ideas of the class topic with some ideas of the activities, even if I don't have them all mapped out every day. Yeah, so I think that's important to pay attention to. One thing I find when I'm teaching on the block is because I'm interacting so much with students, I really learn what they do and don't understand. I mean, I really get an understanding of it because we're in their classroom for 3 hours a day and we're interacting and we're going through something. And so if they don't understand something, it becomes very obvious to me and it can cause me to slow things down. And a lot of times, if I get behind on my schedule, I will start to feel guilty and like I need to be catching back up. And one of the things that I think we found at Quest is that when I used to teach on the semester system, only having an hour to interact with students 3 times a week, I didn't really know how much they understood or how much they didn't. And so I had the impression that if I wrote it on the board and saw a couple people nod, we were good to go. Like everyone understood it, so I could just go to the next topic fine. In reality, that's probably not what was happening at all. Probably people needed some time to wrestle with it. On the block, I can totally tell when they need time to wrestle with it. And that's made me feel like I've had to slow down in a way that I didn't on the semester system. But what I really feel is like for me is that I just didn't realize on the semester system how important it was for me to slow down, and that's the better way to teach. So I find on the block, taking the time to go through things slowly can be very valuable to the students, and it's important not to feel too guilty if that means you're cutting some other things off. The block system is not about trying to get it's not about trying to get information across as much as it is about trying to get a deep understanding of the main ideas. And I think shifting that mentality, I think, is probably one of the hardest things teachers encounter. And it's one of the reasons why people will say, oh, well, the block system sounds great, but it won't work in my subject. What they mean is that they've got all this information in their head that they think that students need to say to students. Fine. That's not the strength of the block. The strength of the block is really to engage in topics deeply. That information comes, but when it comes, it fits in organically rather than just being said by an instructor. So I would say that. Just keep in mind how best to have a deep experience, how best to have the class set up by questions. When I do my planning on my calendar, I have every day have a specific question. So what's today's question? And that really helps me think about how it fits all overall into a story.